This one we've been anticipating for a long time, and we're really excited to finally, now that's not a criticism, Gary, when I say finally, see the diaries. But there's a beautiful, I didn't bring the whole thing because I've got too many books up here as it is, but if you haven't had a chance to, thank you, if you haven't had a chance to look at them yet, 3 very handsomely produced volumes in a slipcase that they've really gone all out to make this a very nice set. So we're excited to have the editor of these volumes. Gary, how long have you been working on these? Where are you, Gary?
6 years.
Oh, there you are. 6 years, okay. So you were 32 when you started. And we got started at similar times. So we're excited to see those. As I mentioned, this is being filmed, and as each of our events is, you can, a week or two later, access all of our author events on our website, benchmarkbooks.com. So we would encourage you to do that. We've had some amazing presentations here that really are unique. They haven't been done anywhere else in exactly that same way. So you can see and hear some wonderful material from a stellar cast of historians, writers, editors, those who have contributed greatly to the field of Mormon studies. So we're going to go in this order, and I will give a brief introduction for each now. Gary Bergera, the editor of the volumes, will be first, and followed by Susan Arrington Madsen. And I understand that you were actually acquainted with the subject of the writer of the book. She has his nose, she says. Well, you better give it back. He's going to look funny in the resurrection without it, you know. Jill Mulvay Derr will be third, James B. Allen, and then Tom Alexander will be our final speaker tonight. Gary James Bergera is the managing director of the Smith Pettit Foundation. He's also the company director of Signature Books. So he's got a lot on his plate in that regard. He's the editor of 2 other compilations of personal writings, the autobiography of B.H. Roberts on Desert Trails with Everett Ruiz. He's the general editor of the Significant Mormon Diary series from Signature Books. Really unrivaled in its quality and in its scope, in my opinion, in Mormon studies. He's received numerous awards. If you haven't read Conflict in the Quorum, what would you call it? I don't know what the right word would be, the relationship between Orson Pratt and Brigham Young. It's a fascinating book. And even though it's not one of his recent books, one that he edited line upon line, Essays on Mormon Doctrine, is one that I recommend to people constantly because of its importance in looking at early Mormon doctrine, particularly on the doctrine of the Godhead. It has some essays in there that are, they're just magnificent. They answer a lot of questions. He also, it's always tricky. He and Devery Anderson, between them, did 3 volumes in this wonderful series. This one is Joseph Smith's Quorum of the Anointed. There's the Nauvoo Endowment Companies, and then Devery did the 3rd volume. And Gary has probably, I was looking at everybody's awards that they've won for their writing tonight, and it would take 20 minutes just to read those. So I'm not going to do that, but keep in mind that each of these, in one way or another, has been recognized for their writing. Gary, what else can I say about you? You're on the editorial board of Journal of Mormon History and the John Whitmer Historical Journal. He's done many, many articles, way too many to mention. All of you here know Gary Bergera's accomplishments. I think he gets embarrassed when I talk about him like this. But I'll tell you one thing that I've never forgotten that he said to me many years ago as he was trying to figure me out. He said, "Kurt, I finally figured out what you are." And I go, "Huh, I really wanted to know what it was." He says, "You're a closet liberal." Have I come out of the closet? No, not yet. Okay. So we're really glad to have Gary with us. I consider him a very close friend. Susan Arrington Madsen. So yes, she was well acquainted with Leonard Arrington, her father. And I'm not even acquainted probably with all that she's done and all the projects that she worked on with her father. But a couple of them were Sunbonnet Sisters, stories about Mormon women, Mothers of the Prophets, and she's going to have some insights that we won't get in any other way. So we're really happy that she had to juggle some things to be here. So I've known Susan for a long time, and she is one person that I admire very, very much and appreciate what she's helped bring about. Jill Mulvay Derr was senior research historian in the church history department for many years, has served as managing director of the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute for Latter-day Saint History at BYU, where she was also associate professor of church history, past president of Mormon History Association. In fact, most of you have been probably that, or yeah, one way or the other. And again, she has many publications. One of the latest and most important that she and others were instrumental in bringing about. The first 50 years of Relief Society, Key Documents in Latter-day Saint Women History. This is a very important book that probably could have never been done 20 or 30 years ago, and is just, I think it represents the kind of scholarship that has taken root in the church in the last decade or two. And Jill is one of the pioneers in that effort, and she's an amazing woman. James B. Allen, wow, his his accomplishments are. The thing that amazes me the most about Jim is that he's got a few years on me, and he's got a lot more energy, and he's the Energizer Bunny of Mormon history. Is that a good characterization?
Well, I know I've got a cane now.
Okay. He joined the religion faculty at BYU in 1963. He was chair of the history department for many years, held the Lemuel Red Chair in Western American History, and was a senior research fellow at the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute, served on its executive committee. One of the things that sorry about that. One of the things that he accomplished along with Glenn Leonard was producing what is still the best and most significant single volume history of the church, the story of the Latter-day Saints. And there's a real history about that. There's a lot in the diaries about this story. Also, I would highly recommend Greg Prince's biography of Leonard Arrington, which is a wonderful biography. But only Jim and Glenn know the best of the price that it took to get this book out and keep it in print. But if he didn't do anything else, Jim, that is an amazing accomplishment. He was assistant church historian while Leonard was church historian. The list goes on and on. One of the things that one of the awards I'll just mention was he won the Leonard J. Arrington Award for Meritorious Service to Mormon History from the Mormon History Association in 2007. Tom Alexander has served in many historical and academic organizations. He was also president of MHA. Excuse me, I'm going on too long, but he has a list of accomplishments and positions that are fairly unrivaled. He produced a couple of books. Mormonism in Transition is, in my opinion, and the opinion of many others, the finest work on that transitional period in Mormon history that's ever been done. I turn to it over and over again. History of the Latter-day Saints, 1890 to 1930. He also did an award-winning biography of Wilford Woodruff, Things in Heaven and Earth. Tom, as well as these other authors, has an ability to, in an even-handed and balanced way, present issues and history in a way that few others could accomplish in terms of their effectiveness and the ability to zero in on history and its importance to us today. Okay, that's plenty long for me. We're going to go in that order that I mentioned, and then we'll have Q&A, and we really appreciate you being here. Let me get these out of the way. So, Gary, let's hook you up. Put that on here. I'll do it if you want. So usually, we're going to give it a shot if you want to just stick that. Okay. Good. Let's see if that works.
Does that work? Can everybody hear me?
Not at all.
Not at all?
Okay, let's
I can hold it.
get it.
Put it on his shirt
Let's do
collar.
it up here. Let's try it.
Is this any better?
Still not?
Marginally?
We put it on.
How about this?
Sure you know.
All right. I'm good.
Put it on your lower.
That's mine.
Oh, sorry. Put it on your lower lip.
Looks
See
like
how-
good.
Get these out of the way here.
In thinking about what might be of interest to most of you regarding the publication of the Diaries of Leonard Arrington, I've decided that rather than attempt to summarize the contents of the diaries, I instead would provide some background into the origins of the project. Discussions with the Arrington family, as represented by Susan Arrington Madsen, regarding the publication of the diaries began in late 2011. These followed an initial outreach by longtime Arrington family friend Lance Owens. I think the principal goal of these discussions was to gain a better understanding of each party's hopes and expectations. A formal contract between the Smith Pettit Foundation and the Arrington Family Trust was signed on January 10, 2012. At that point, work on preparing the diaries for publication began in earnest. While Arrington maintained diaries prior to late 1971, I decided to focus on the years I believe to be of greatest interest to the majority of readers. Thus, the published version of the diaries begins shortly before Arrington's appointment as LDS Church Historian, which occurred in early 1972, continues through his directorship of the LDS Church History Division and of the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute for Church History, and concludes with the years of his retirement. Though he kept diaries before his appointment as church historian, not until that time did Arrington approach the task of documenting his life with the focus and self-awareness that characterized the undertaking thereafter. Sometime between 1972 and February 1974, Arrington began to assemble in letter-size loose-leaf binders a series of scrapbooks he labeled Diary. These scrapbooks included, among other items, copies of diary entries he had recorded previously. After 1981, Arrington abandoned the scrapbooks but continued to keep a diary as loose letter-size sheets. Arrington's papers were acquired by the library at Utah State University in stages, beginning in 1982 and continuing until after Arrington's death in early 1999. As is common practice, the library's special collections disassembled the 24 scrapbooks covering the period from birth through 1981 and placed the pages in archival boxes and folders. These diaries today comprise boxes 21 to 35 of Arrington's papers. boxes 36 to 52, contain the remainder of Arrington's diary from 1982 on. On January 7, 1959, Arrington began to maintain with greater regularity a diary usually typed. From 1959 to November 1971, Arrington's diary reads mostly like an appointment calendar, with the occasional brief annotation or note to self. However, when it became clear in late 1971 that Arrington's career might take a significant turn, he decided, prompted by son Carl, to document more fully major events in his life. Thereafter, through December 1981, Arrington's diary contains, in addition to Arrington's typed diary entries, an even greater variety of autobiographical materials, including, but not limited to, copies of letters to and from Arrington, minutes of meetings of LDS Church Historical Department executives and managers, internal reports usually generated by the Historical Department, brief excerpts from the diaries of some colleagues, copies of speeches, clippings from newspapers and magazine articles, obituaries, the printed programs of history conferences and similar meetings, local and regional LDS Church bulletins and announcements, public statements and press releases, theater, plays, musicals, operas, ballets, etc. programs, trips and vacation itineraries, restaurant menus, greeting cards, Christmas cards, birthday cards, miscellaneous memoranda, and scraps of printed and other material Arrington believed to be important. Arrington's shift in how he maintained his diary beginning in late 1981, early 1982, seems to have been prompted by the gradual redefinition beginning in 1977-78 of his job, from church historian to director of the Church History Division, and his division's subsequent relocation, finalized in August 1982, from the Church Historical Department in Salt Lake City to the newly created Joseph Fielding Smith Institute for Church History at BYU. Evidently, Arrington came to view his formal diary entries as of decreasing importance given his move away from church headquarters, his diminishing involvement in the daily grind of professional history making, and the approach of his retirement in 1987. As he grew older, and especially in retirement, Arrington recorded fewer and shorter diary entries. He continued to insert other material into his diary, but it appears that health, energy, and interest lagged. Also, since he no longer enjoyed secretarial support, what diary entries he did compose he typically typed himself rather than dictated. What seems to be the last formal diary entry is dated January 10, 1997, a little more than 2 years before Arrington's death. To an extent before 1997, but especially after, Arrington's regular letters to his children functioned increasingly as the primary chronological narrative of his life, though the focus of the letters was more personal than professional. During the early stages of preparing Arrington's diaries for publication, I made two decisions. First, I would not attempt a typographical facsimile reproduction, but rather a clean transcription of the diaries as I believe Arrington intended. This means that instead of tracking all changes to the original text, I silently, without always alerting readers, made all of Arrington's own changes to the text of the diaries. Second, I extracted the entries labeled diary, or from context understood to be original diary entries, rather than reproduced the entire contents of the scrapbooks, the theater programs, the trip itineraries, the newspaper and magazine clippings, etc. These clearly identified diary entries, it seemed to me, comprised the actual diary, and the supplementary material Arrington included did not. As the number of explicitly labeled diary entries began to dwindle, however, I incorporated into the diary what struck me as especially relevant excerpts from Arrington's letters to his children. I acknowledge the subjective nature of this decision, but I believe the inclusion of such material, selected judiciously I hope, rounds out and completes both the diary and the narrative of Arrington's life. Regarding the identification of people cited in the diaries, I tried to annotate, using publicly available information, the men and women who appeared to be significant in Arrington's life. I did not attempt to identify people whom Arrington mentions only in passing. Nor did I try to identify all the major events in the person's life, only those that seemed most relevant and most useful in helping to place the person in the context of the diaries. The majority of errors and possibly inadequacies that exist in the annotations will probably be found in the identifications of people. To any who may find the facts of his or her life or the lives of his or her family members misstated or less than fully stated, I apologize in advance. Entitling the publication of the diaries Confessions of a Mormon Historian, I drew upon some inspiration from Arrington himself. One of the possible titles he toyed with for his autobiography, subsequently published in 1998 as Adventures of a Church Historian, was Confessions. I also like and find it appropriate that the verb confess traces back to the Latin confessio, meaning to acknowledge, and may refer specifically to acknowledging one's faith or matters of one's faith. As Gary Wills points out in his brief biography of St. Augustine, quote, "The term that best covers this range of meanings for confessio is testimony," end quote. Thus, and despite confession's corollary as admitting to transgression, etc., I think confessions, as testimony, accurately represents the contents of the diaries. The published version of the Arrington Diaries represents the combined efforts of many people, in addition to myself. These include, but are not limited to, artist Parshall, who prepared a preliminary typescript of the diaries based on scans of the originals supplied by the Arrington family, Susan Arrington Madsen, who proofed the entire annotated typescript several times and kindly provided the foreword, Becky Bartholomew, who adapted her several studies of Arrington into a standalone biographical introduction that situates for readers Arrington prior to his appointment as LDS Church Historian, Christine Rigby Arrington, Richard Jensen, and Brian Buchanan, who each separately proofed the entire manuscript and caught more than a few errors, Lavina Fielding Anderson and Joseph Geisner, who provided the chronology, Thomas Alexander, who wrote for this publication his own personal reminiscence of Arrington, Jeff Johnson, who compiled the bibliography of Arrington's publications, Brad Cole and the members of the staff at Special Collections, Utah State University Library, Janie Fleet and the members of Signature Books staff, including Ron Prittis, John Hatch, Deborah Anderson, Keiko Jones, and designer Jason Francis. If you like the look of the diaries, that's all Jason. And George Smith and the Smith Pettit Foundation, who gave me the time to work on the diaries. As I contemplate the diaries, I have come to believe that the careful reading of them will bring the reader as close to knowing another person as is possible. I have also come to believe that every reader's experience with Arrington and his diaries will be different. I really appreciate the opportunity of having been able to share some of my thoughts with you tonight regarding the editing of the Arrington Diaries. Thanks.
Well, let's see. Can you hear me back there? Should we do this?
Yeah.
Is that better? Okay, I'll hold it as close as I can. I appreciate very much being invited to represent my brothers and I in this great occasion of these diaries coming out. I'll tell you, Gary Bergera is a remarkable man, and everything seemed to fall into place for him to do this, and I will forever be grateful for him. He is a genius when it comes to the editing work that he has done and separating things into chapters, and he just really did a great job. The footnotes and the notations at the bottom of the pages make this far more valuable than the original, really. For a while there, he was calling me almost every day, asking me, who's this person, who's this person? And I knew quite a few of them. And one day he called me and said, who's Josie? I said, Josie? Yeah, I'm reading here about Josie. Oh yeah, that was our black Cocker Spaniel. So he was very thorough in checking out who's who. I'm just going to pull out a few entries that had some importance to me or had some significance. Thought you might be interested. My father was an advisor to Dialogue for some time, and they ran their articles past him most of the time. But on one occasion they ran I think it was even in the second volume, they ran a story, an article written by J.D. Williams, about church and state relationships, and it took a bit of a swipe on Ezra Taft Benson. And when Dad read the article, which he had not seen, had a chance to give his opinion on, he knew there was going to be trouble, and there was. And what happened was something that was a total surprise to me. You know, they say, when you read your dad's diaries, were there any surprises? Well, this was one for me. Apparently, Al Masani, who was assistant to the Quorum of the 12 at the time, had nominated my father to be mission president in Italy. And his name had passed several levels, and they were about to the point of contacting him and interviewing him to be this mission president in Italy. And Elder Benson, in seeing Dad's name in connection with this magazine dialogue that he felt like was very anti-Mormon, removed my father's name from the list. And that made me sad. And but anyway, that's the kind of a thing that I learned about that I hadn't known before. You know, my father loved Italy. He loved everything about it, food, customs that they had, and just everything. He loved it. So that's something I think he might have enjoyed. There were other things that were hard to read about, and you will come across those as you read the diary, and yet it's the story, it's what happened. And so it was really fun sometimes, occasionally in the diary, to see some humor coming through. And I remember reading and just thinking, oh, this is so Dad. He says, the home teachers came tonight while I was watching TV. And I was right in the middle of a show it was called Hogan's Heroes. It was like one of his favorites. He says, my home teachers came, and I spent the rest of my life wondering what happened. So he was not happy about that. He writes in his diary, he received this letter from a nephew. It says, Dear Uncle Leonard, we saw you on TV last night. My father said, don't worry, you're smarter than you look. I want to go to college, but my father said I need to go at least to the 8th grade to be as smart as you. At school, we're studying polecats. We think of you often. Now, whether he really got that letter or whether he clipped it out of a newspaper, I don't know. But anyway, it's fun to see some humor. And, you know, Dad was such a great journal keeper, diarist, and he not only had, you know, I did this and this, but he, as has been said, had newspaper clippings and poems and restaurant programs and menus. And the only thing is, as I saw all this detail he put on the flight he took from Salt Lake to New York, what they served him, what the refreshments were, who he sat by, and how they were related to Peter Mon, and on and on. It was odd for me to see that he didn't write anything about my wedding. Gary had to help me work that out in my mind. But anyway, that was interesting. Another humorous thing that I got such a bang out of, he came home from work one day and he had a split in the back of his pants. And as my mother said, not only did he have a split in his pants, but it showed. And so she said, Leonard, your pants are split. And he just, those of you who know him could see him saying this. He said, you know, I thought I felt an extra ventilation today. Kind of a breeze. So he came home and that was his reaction. Just to kind of wrap this up, I think one of the things I appreciated, you know, I've actually had some people say, well, maybe your father didn't intend for this journal to be published. Maybe he, you know, had really we had decided ahead of time that they wouldn't be published, they shouldn't be. But here's what he said about that. He said, "The story of the two apostles who opposed our work and the first presidency may never be told from their point of view, because church records do not record conflict. The only voices that will be published will be those of the beleaguered historians who tried their best. I hope I have been fair-minded in what I have written." So we're proud of Dad. We're so grateful for those of you who were so supportive of him, showed him your friendship, and we're thrilled to see his story being told and that he really is going to have the last word on some of the things that he experienced. Thank you.
Well, it is an honor to be here, and certainly one of the great honors of my life were the years that intersected with Leonard Arrington. I am so pleased with to learn what Gary has done and completed, and I have such respect and love for Susan, there she is, and for her family. I first became acquainted with Leonard Arrington in the fall of 1973, and I will just never forget that day through Catherine Hansen, now Schertz, and Maureen Ursenbach Beecher. I had come to the history division, which was then just over a year old, and was greeted warmly and joyfully by Leonard. I don't know that I know many people who take such joy in knowing people as Leonard did. I think of joy and obedience and just a great love for people, and I felt that immediately. He wanted to know who I was and where I came from and who my ancestors were, and I'll never forget sitting down on one of these little ledges in our old church office building office, sat down with Leonard, a great scholar by then, and I was absolutely no one, having come off school teaching for 2 years in the Boston Public Schools. And he treated me with such great respect. I've just never forgotten that one-on-one, and he was eager to have me work there and take on working on the poetry of Eliza R. Snow with Maureen Beecher. He respected people and he trusted people. I loved working with Jim and with Davis, the assistant church historians, and all three of them sent me to work on projects that were far beyond my pale and my understanding. It took me a while to figure out that Kirtland came before Missouri and all kinds of things. I was totally new, but Leonard was very supportive. And especially he was supportive of women's history. He had done that early work on the economic role of pioneer Mormon women, published way earlier, almost 16 years earlier in 1955. And he was so eager to press forward women's history. He was a generous scholar. He opened up his files to everyone. And by the time I got there, he had a great collection of files on individual women that he opened not only to Maureen and myself, but to other women who came forward with an interest in women's history. This was the beginning of Linda Newell and Val Tippett Avery beginning their work on Emma Smith. It was the beginning of Vicki Burgess Olson starting her work on collecting biographies of women for Sister Saints. And Leonard was just so supportive of that work and so enthusiastic about it. He had worked with Kenneth and Audrey Godfrey to undertake their work on the book that became Women's Voices after the history division moved to BYU. It was published in 1982. So such a supporter of everyone's work and so respecting of scholars of every ilk, whether they were amateurs or professionals, whether they were LDS or RLDS, whether they were interested in social history or quantitative history, economic history, Western history. Leonard's interests were broad, and his support and generosity was broad indeed. I remember one of my last encounters with Leonard came probably in the late 80s, after Brooke and I had been to France and come back, and I reconnected with the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute for Church History colleagues at BYU. This was after Leonard retired, and he had been promised a continuation of his office space, but we were crowded there at the Institute, and I got stuck in Leonard's office, or his files got stuck in the office assigned to me. And it was wonderful to work with his carefully typed, labeled files around me. But it was also sad when he came in to work and I was there. And I think he felt a little displaced and I felt a little awkward. That was a tender moment for me, because I knew that there was no way that I should be in his space. It was a little moment of sadness, I think, for both of us. On the other hand, I think of our book that Kurt held up for you, The First 50 Years of Relief Society. What an ultimate realization it represents of some of the early dreams that Leonard had, and the transparency and openness that he worked for. And I think those early foundations that he set are certainly dreams that are being realized in a different generation. As I say, a great honor that my life intersected with Leonard's, and a great joy.
What Jill, can you hear me okay? What Jill said about the way Leonard welcomed her into the historical department of the church was only representative of really what Leonard Arrington was. He was so interested in everybody, whether they were historians or not, anybody that came into the historical department to talk to him for any reason. He'd immediately want to know something about them, who they were, and immediately almost he would relate, oh, your ancestor was so-and-so. He would know. and that was just Leonard. I thought I'd like to spend just a few minutes reminiscing about my own association with Leonard right from the beginning in 1954. My first association with Leonard came when I was a senior in college at Utah State University. And I took a graduate class, actually. They allowed me to take it from George Ellsworth on how to write history. And as I went into that class, George Ellsworth introduced us all, and one of the people in the class was a young professor of economics at Utah State University by the name of Leonard Arrington. And we learned that Leonard was there for the purpose of trying to learn how to turn economics into history. And of course this was the beginning of a very nice relationship between Leonard and George Ellsworth. And but it was also the beginning of a very long and very warm relationship between Leonard and myself, because one of the things that Leonard could do is keep track of people. And no matter where I went, I felt Leonard was keeping track of me, even when I was down in Southern California working on my degree. And when I finished my degree and finally published a book that was my degree, Leonard was the first one to congratulate me on the book. And I just thought, what a wonderful thing that Leonard Arrington, who became so well known for Great Basin Kingdom, and this is what he published as a result of the work that he did with George Ellsworth. George helped him kind of learn how to do this. Was just really very, very satisfying to me. Well, I'd like to just say a couple of more things about Leonard. They mentioned his sense of humor. I don't know where this expression came from, but I heard it from Leonard every once in a while. When somebody had a little problem, he'd say, "Don't fret your gizzard." I don't know whether he learned that from Brigham or what, but I thought that was an interesting expression. Don't fret your gizzard. Do you remember hearing that from him? A lot. I learned about some of his likes and dislikes. He loved licorice ice cream. I had never heard of licorice ice cream. But when we wanted to satisfy Leonard, we'd take him a dish of licorice ice cream. But he was always also interested in, as we said, people. Whenever we'd go to a convention, in the early days especially, he would take every Mormon historian he could find that was at the...
Move it away just a little bit and see if
Oh, okay, you don't want me
that...
to...
Little way, well, just, we're getting a lot of popping there, so... Just
How
try
about
it,
this?
just try it, try it.
Okay. He would take every Mormon historian he could find, that's still doing it, and put them around in a circle and insist that everybody tell what they were working on. And if they weren't working on something, what are you going to work on? It was that kind of thing. So he was interested in people, but he's interested in what was going on in their lives. But one of the most important things to me about Leonard that I think a lot of people did not realize at the time, there was a lot of criticism of the kind of history he was writing. There were some people who felt that Leonard was not as religious as he ought to be. But the Leonard I got to know was a very devout, religious, deeply spiritual man. And that hit me really hard the first time that we met together as assistant church historians, Davis and I, and this story is in the book, and Dean Jesse knelt down in prayer the first day that we met together as a staff. And the prayer that Leonard offered was exhilarating to me, simply because it was so deeply spiritual and so deeply concerned about helping people build testimonies through the kind of honest history that we would write. And that was the kind of person Leonard was. I remember at one point Leonard asked Davis and I to come to his home with him because Grace was ill. And Leonard wanted us to help minister to Grace. And of course that's a normal request, but what impressed me as much as anything was the time he spent prayerfully deciding on the kind of prayer he would give as he gave the blessing to Grace. And I was just honored to be involved in that kind of spiritual experience with Leonard. His insistence on honest, unvarnished history grew out of his own faith that honest history is the only way to help young people stay in the church, because he figured that if they saw some of the problems of the church from the standpoint of people who were not in the church, that it could hurt them. But if they see good, honest, faithful Mormon historians writing history and talking about some of the problems and controversies in history, that it would help them because they would be seeing it from the standpoint of people who also had faith. And I
agree.
Thank you. Well, and I appreciated that, and that's of course what we tried to do. He wrote in not an aha form, but the kind of just straightforward form. Well, again, my 5 minutes is up, but I just want to emphasize, and I'm sure maybe there'll be a question and answer session where we may want to know more, but Leonard's whole attitude, even toward the problems that we had, was an attitude, it will all work out. He was one of the most optimistic people I ever knew. It will all work out. And I appreciated that in Leonard. Thank you very much.
I think it's appropriate that I back clean up here, as Kurt said. I wrote the afterword in the diary, so you can see what my relationship with Leonard was in there, but I want to talk about that a little bit. I got to know Leonard first through his writing. In 1959, Leonard was in Italy, in Genoa, as a visiting Fulbright professor. I took George Ellsworth's class in Utah history that year. There wasn't any textbook for Utah history at that time, and George said you could read one of two books, either Leonard Arrington's Great Basin Kingdom or Mulder and Mortenson's Among the Mormons. Well, I decided to read both of them, but I got to know Leonard through his work in Great Basin Kingdom. The next year, Leonard was back, and I took his course in economic history of the United States. I found it interesting. He brought in vignettes that helped to enliven the course. I got to know him, and apparently I impressed him in some way because he asked me if I would work for him the next summer. And as some of you may know, Leonard was in the stake presidency of the Utah State University stake. The stake had been organized by the church because so many young single adults and even some young married adults were leaving the church because the church seemed irrelevant to them, particularly to young single adults. And the church had decided that what it needed to do was to organize stakes at universities, and Utah State University stake was one of the first that was organized. Leonard was a member of the stake presidency, and he asked me to write a history of the Utah State University stake, and I did that during the summer of 1960. I don't have a copy of that anymore. I assume there may be a copy in Leonard's papers. Do you know whether there is, Susan?
I'm sure there is.
I'd like to get a copy of it. And this was some indication of Leonard's association with the church. Well, in 1960, I left Utah State. I had earned my bachelor's and master's degrees there and went to the University of California at Berkeley. But when I left, Leonard told me that he wanted to hire me again to work with him on some projects. Well, I hadn't heard any more about it during the school year, but one day I was walking through the library at Berkeley, and who should I run into but Leonard Arrington? I reminded him that he had said he wanted to hire me again, and he said, "Yes, I do. I'd like you to come back next summer and work with me on a series of articles on defense installations in Utah." He'd gotten a grant for that. Well, I told him I'd be interested in doing that, but I needed to talk with my wife first. Marilyn and I had talked about what I might do in the summer, and we thought maybe I could work on construction or something like that. And she was very much opposed to my coming back and working with Leonard Arrington. She was teaching high school at Miramonte High School in Orinda, and the high school ran longer than the college did. So I would be out and would have to come back to Logan a couple of weeks before she was out of school, and she thought that would really be bad. It would be better if I worked on construction than to work in writing with Leonard Arrington. Well, for perhaps the only time in our marriage, I said that I really wanted to do that, and she finally agreed with me. So what that led to was a series of articles on the defense installations here in Utah. So by the time I had finished my PhD, I had 6 articles published. Now, that's not unusual today, but in 1960 through 1964, it was something that was quite unusual, and my major professor, Walton Bean, thought that that was really odd that a graduate student would publish that many articles before he'd finished his PhD. Well, this helped me because Leonard wrote letters, and Walton Bean wrote letters saying that I'd already published all of this stuff, and it happened that Fresno State University and Brigham Young University got into a bidding war over my services. Here's a new assistant professor coming in, and I decided to go to BYU, both because they offered me more money and because I would be working in the field that I wanted to. If I'd gone to Fresno, I would have been their expert in California history, but at BYU I could work in Mormon, Utah, and Western history, and that's essentially what I did. We finished that series of articles. They were published in the Utah Historical Quarterly and in the Pacific Historical Review. Everett Cooley, who was the editor of the Utah Historical Quarterly, got considerable flack for publishing these articles on Utah and the Second World War. Some people said, well, that's not history, that's current events. But Everett thought it was important to do that. Jim and I were both in San Francisco in December of 1965 when the Mormon History Association was organized. We passed around a sheet of paper where everyone who was there was to sign their name. Interestingly, Leonard was conducting the meeting, and his name is not on that list. We elected him president, the first president of the Mormon History Association, and I continued to have some contact with Leonard down to 1972, when Leonard was appointed as church historian, but he was also given the Lemuel Hardison Redd Jr. Chair in Western American History at BYU and the directorship of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies. Well, Leonard spent most of his time in Salt Lake, and somebody had to carry on the day-to-day operation of the Redd Center, so Leonard asked me to be assistant director, and then I served later as associate director, and finally when the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute came to BYU, Leonard couldn't be director of two institutions there, and so I became director of the Redd Center, and eventually, like Jim, I was appointed to the same chair that Leonard had held previously. I admired my association with Leonard. I was not director of the Redd Center. Leonard and I met together. We discussed the publication program of the Redd Center. We talked about the lecture series that we were going to do. We discussed the various people who could come and the various things that the Redd Center could do. Leonard was the director. My responsibility there was sort of acting as an executive director, carrying on the day-to-day operation of the Redd Center. I remember particularly one incident. We decided to go over the Hole in the Rock Trail. As many of you know, Charlie Redd's ancestors were Hole in the Rock pioneers. We worked with Leonard's oldest son, Hardy Redd, in organizing a trip over the Hole in the Rock Trail. Many of you will have gone over the trail from Escalante down to the Hole in the Rock. You can almost do that in a regular car. The difficult part is after you cross the Colorado River, you go up on Gray Mesa and you go around there for a while, and then it's really difficult on the eastern part of the Hole in the Rock Trail. Well, I was driving a Jeep with Leonard in the back. Hardy was driving a Bronco. We went into what looked to me like a box canyon, and then Hardy took off up the side, and I figured, well, okay, if he could drive a Bronco up the side, why, I could certainly drive a Jeep that way. On the road, we hit the first bump. Leonard grabbed hold of the roll bar, and I was told by people who were behind me that he grabbed onto that bar and held it most of the way. Well, my association with Leonard continued. After Leonard passed away, his second wife, Harriet, called me and asked if I would speak at his funeral. She said that Leonard had rewritten his funeral 5 times, and she said that I was the only one who appeared on every one of those editions of his funeral. I was really honored to do that. President Hinckley spoke, Davis Bitten spoke, a couple of other people did. I always admired Leonard, and I loved him. as Jim pointed out, Leonard was a faithful member of the church. He had a strong testimony, contrary to what some people have said about him. And he was a man that I loved and that I appreciated. He helped my career perhaps more than anyone else. Thank you.
You don't often get a team of people like that to speak at an occasion like this. We've been very fortunate to have those who were so close to Leonard and help him accomplish what he did. So we thank our contributors and speakers tonight. We're going to have a question answer at this point. And so let's kind of see how it goes. We don't want to keep you here all night, but Gary, do you want to kind of referee?
Is that what you want that?
If you'll moderate, yeah. If
You could moderate too.
Okay, well, whatever.
You're a good moderator.
Okay. So, yeah, we'll just direct
Very
them.
moderate.
I'll stay up here just in the interest of time. What'd you say?
You're very moderate.
So, yeah, who's got questions, we'll get it directed to the person that you want. Jamie, have you your hand up? No. Well, maybe this will be shorter than I thought. Questions? Serious? This has never happened in the history of these events. Wow. George.
Well, I'm a little embarrassed to be asking the question because I worked a little bit with Gary and others on the Arrington Diaries and Journals. They're a remarkable collection when you think of what the history entails. Initially, ancient history, gold plates, if you will, and migrations. And then when Arrington was in charge of history, then he is at some point separated from the historical record. So my question to you, Gary, is when he is separated from the record and yet continues his work, that's a statement in the realm of historical writing. And that record is a very unique record since he kept writing it and you had it put together for publication. How did that happen? How did you bring that about?
You're asking about the actual process of working on the diary?
What was the key to get the diaries together?
Well, the key, one of the keys, so there were several keys probably, and one of them was Lance Owens, who is here tonight. Another key is Susan, and together they basically, they were kind of the catalyst. I can't overstate Lance's involvement at the very beginning, Susan's involvement throughout, Artis Parshall, who is here also. It took 6 years to get these out. Without Artis's involvement at the beginning to help with providing the transcript, they wouldn't be out yet. And there are people like that at various stages who contributed more than they realized in helping to produce the final published version. I had the luxury of being able to spend my time, my work time, working on the diaries too. If this had been a project outside of work, that would have also added to it. I'm identified as the editor, but there are a lot of people who were involved in this at various stages. And I can't really express my appreciation enough to everybody who was involved and who was able to take Leonard's diaries from the originals or the scans of the originals that we had to work with and then continue to proof. And as I mentioned in my comments, the number of people who were involved just in the proofing process before signature got involved and then after signature got involved too. There were various levels of proofing and people who had opportunities to provide insights, their own insights, which I didn't know about. And I should also say that there were a lot of people who knew Leonard. I could ask. It was one of the really sobering experiences of working on the diaries over the last 6 years, is the number of people who I contacted to help me answer questions that I encountered working on the diaries who have since passed away. The other thing that'll be really interesting, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier at another event, you know, a lot of Leonard's colleagues in the History Division and even outside the History Division in the library kept diaries during this period of time. And there are some really good diaries that are out there. Davis Bitten's diaries at BYU. I'm not sure where Ron Walker's diary will end up, but there are also others that are still, you know, being maintained. And so 50, 60, 70 years from now, there's going to be, you know, it's going to be pretty amazing to see what shows up and is available. And maybe somebody else will have the opportunity of being able to work on those.
I think that maybe what George was asking, though, Gary, was how you handle the transition the transitions in Leonard's life and kind of the controversies and so forth. And I think that those things are contextualized but not sensationalized. And I don't know if that's maybe what he's getting at, but some of those things are a little difficult to negotiate.
Are you talking about like the episodes in his life, one episode from another?
And certain themes, certain issues that he had to deal with, and you know. And,
Well, that's an interesting question, I think, because I wasn't aware going through it that there was necessarily a narrative thread, a consistent narrative thread through the diaries. It was just like one entry, and especially at the beginning, looking at the mass of material and thinking, I just want to get through this day, and I want to get through the next day before I worry about, I didn't see light at the end of the tunnel for a while. And so as I'm working on it, I'm not aware of any kind of superstructure that controls the narrative. It's just taking one day at a time, one incident at a time, sometimes working backwards. It was tempting in some of the annotations to go backwards, or especially to go forwards, and that was hard sometimes. Annotation is just, it's an art, you know, and I don't know how successful I am or we are at it, because I don't want to provide too much information. I don't want the annotations to be a distraction for people, and I don't want to give too much away because, you know, I don't want to spoil for the reader what's going to come up. So I don't know if that kind of addresses the question, but it's much clearer afterwards. As I'm working through these forests, I don't always know what's going on, and so it can be a challenge sometimes. And I don't know that I'm aware now of everything, but I know a little bit more now, I think.
Frank?
What are some of the most interesting things that you found inside the diary, you personally, that just...
Well, this is, you know,
You gotta repeat, come on.
okay, what are some of the most interesting things for me that I found in the diaries? Susan, I think, mentioned some things that she didn't know about before. So you know, if you've read Arrington's Adventures of a Church Historian, and if you've read Greg Prince's biography, I don't know how much new of that period of time, Leonard Arrington's supervision of the Church History Division and his years as church historian, I don't know how much of that was new to me. Some of the day-to-day events, the minutia was new to me, but what actually struck me, and I hope Susan won't mind me saying, is the personal side to her father, especially after he left church headquarters and after retirement, and watching Leonard be in situations that he wasn't always prepared for. As intelligent as he was, especially after Grace's death, there were some things that just mystified him. There's an entry where he's figuring out how to cook a TV dinner, and it's like, you know, it's very funny, but it's also kind of instructive about how lost, you know, when you haven't had to deal with these things before, to all of a sudden find yourself confronting them can be a challenge. So the personal side to Leonard was surprising for me to encounter.
Question.
Is this for Gary?
Yeah,